Question time is meant to be an opportunity to scrutinise the government. Instead, the reality is that the government transforms question time into a farce. The government and opposition take turns asking questions to ministers, and this is a fairly standard question when it's the government's turn.
How is the Morrison government's well-established record of providing tax incentives and tax cuts to small family businesses, especially in my electorate of Reid, helping the Australian economy to generate more jobs for all Australians?
So far, this is a fake question called a Dorothy Dixer. I go into this in detail in my previous video, but it's a planted question the government gives itself to rattle off a prepared answer. But then the question gets worse.
And is our Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the...
The first part of the answer is government propaganda, but then he gets to the alternative policies. Remember, the point of questions are to hold the government to account.
Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, the 12th man of Australian politics, the person who brings out the drinks, the member for Rankin, Mr. Speaker, he came, Mr. Speaker, and gave a speech last night. It was an 11-page speech about himself. 11-page speech about himself. And he spoke about his credentials for the job. He described his experience as being unusual, if not unique. And what was his biggest credential for this job, Mr. Speaker? Having worked for Wayne Swan, Mr. Speaker. The Treasurer,
A parliamentary committee looking into question time handed down its report a year ago, in March 2021. In that report, one of the things it considered was the use of the alternative policies tagline. The use of alternative policies or alternative approaches apparently started in the 1980s, but it's become a complete joke now. It seems like almost every government question has this phrase tacked onto the back of it.
And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
And is the Minister aware of any alternative policy approaches?
And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
So what's the point of this type of question? Asking a minister about alternative policies is a loophole to the standing orders. The standing orders, which are the rules that apply to Parliament, say that the minister's answer needs to be directly relevant to the question. So by asking about alternative policies, this lets the minister talk about the alternatives, meaning they then attack the opposition or minor parties. But the rules also say that ministers can only be asked about areas they have responsibility over. I'm not sure how a minister has responsibility over the policies of the opposition to then be asked about them and criticise them. In fact, some speakers in the past have not allowed the alternative policies tagline to be used at all, but more recent speakers have been open to it. Remember that the speaker is supposed to be the umpire who enforces the rules, but Andrew Wallace, the current speaker, has allowed these types of questions to go unchecked. This might explain why. Here is Andrew Wallace before he became the Speaker.
Will the Minister update the House on the progress of the Morrison government's technology-led approach to reducing emissions? How does this ensure that we create jobs and strengthen industry as we reduce emissions? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
It's not surprising that he didn't take a strict stance on this when he became the Speaker. The problem is that the Speaker is not independent. The current Speaker is part of the Liberal National Party. The Speaker is meant to be the umpire, except imagine if the umpire is actually one of the players. Not exactly a fair situation. The committee report I mentioned earlier referenced a number of submissions that said an independent Speaker should be considered, which is actually a good idea, but it was deemed to be out of scope for their inquiry. Why should someone who is part of the government be deciding whether the government is following the rules? What you get is decisions that allow the alternative policies questions to be asked. And here are some examples of what happens when you allow these questions. When the Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce was asked about alternative approaches, this was his rant.
Because the Labor Party just want the votes, but they're going to leave the people behind. They always do. They always do. They never actually present themselves. And although we may see the member for Grain or the leader of the opposition in regional areas at times, we'll never see the member for Sydney coming up to central Queensland to stand behind the coal miners. We'll never. We're looking forward to Minister Penny Wong going to central Queensland, the Hunter Valley, to stand behind the coal miners, or maybe the member for Port Adelaide to go to the Hunter Valley and stand behind the coal mines because they don't believe in these industries.
It's hard to know what to say to this, but I think the opposition summed it up best.
Yeah, I'm not sure how this stream of consciousness can be directly relevant to anything. Like, he's referring to seats that don't exist. He's meandering around. The opposition
business will resume his seat.
Similarly, when Peter Dutton was asked about alternative approaches, he decided to use that opportunity to say this.
And Mr. Speaker, we now see evidence, Mr. Speaker, that the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, has also made a decision about who they're going to back in the next federal election, Mr. Speaker. Now, that's open. That is obvious, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of the House...
And they have picked this bloke as their candidate, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of the House will resume his seat.
The government has really been politicising national security in the past weeks. So much, in fact, that the head of ASIO, Australia's spy agency, did a rare interview to clarify some points.
I was joined earlier for an exclusive interview with the Director-General of ASIO, Mike Burgess.
The foreign interference is against all members of Parliament, so it doesn't go after one particular party or the other, so it's kind of equal opportunity in that regard.
A quick tangent. This is what fake moderate Dave Sharma had to say in response to the head of ASIO.
You know, I don't want to live in an Australia where we can't debate certain things because our spy chiefs tell us not to. I think they also need to be careful not to interfere in what's properly the domain of political debate and elected representatives.
For a really good overview of this saga, check out this video by Swollen Pickles. Links are in the description. Other parliaments in Australia have thankfully been doing something about these types of questions. For example, in both New South Wales and the ACT, questions cannot include the alternative policies line. This should also be the case at the federal level. The committee report I've been referencing did in fact make a strong recommendation on all of this. It recommended that the rules be changed so that questions during question time cannot ask about alternative approaches. The committee recognised that all this is a way for ministers to attack the opposition in their answers. But it's been a year since then, and the government shows no signs of adopting the recommendations. They are instead making the most they can out of this tactic. If you're supporting this channel on Patreon, then thank you. If you want to help grow this channel, please consider checking out the links in the description.